Welcome to the Be Well Collective, a refreshingly grounded podcast dedicated to separating health fact from fiction, offering listeners access to credible, science-based conversations on a wide array of health topics. Each episode features discussions led by medical professionals and experts, providing listeners with the evidence-based insights to navigate the often confusing world of health and wellness with confidence and clarity. Now let's nourish our minds and get into it. Hey, welcome back to the Be Well Collective. We are so glad you are here with us. Today, we are covering a topic that touches every one of us at some point, grief and loss, whether it is the loss of a loved one, a relationship, a sense of identity, or even the life you thought you were going to have. Grief shows up in ways we did not always anticipate. And there's no manual or perfect guide on how to manage grief. From changes in mood and energy to shifts in eating patterns and self-care, grief can ripple through every part of life.
Hey there, I'm Riley, and we're going to be talking all about grief today. Grief is tricky. It can affect both the mind and our bodies, how it shapes our emotions, our routine, our appetite, and just the capacity to cope with things. Grief isn't just emotional, it could be physical, psychological, and deeply personal. Almost all of us are going to go through grief at some point in our lives, right? Yet so many people feel unprepared as to how it actually unfolds.
We will talk about how grief impacts the nervous system, daily functioning, and how and why our bodies respond the way that they do. We will further unpack this topic from both a mental health and nutritional care lens to better understand its complexity.
We want to acknowledge that this episode could be tender. We're talking about grief and loss, something that looks different for everyone. So during this episode, please take care of yourself. Take a break if you need. Pause this episode if you need. I invite you to check in with yourself right now in this moment. Ask yourself two things. One, how are you doing today? Do you need anything extra before jumping into the episode? And two, check in with how grief has hit you in the past. Your own stuff is likely going to impact what we're talking about today. So, just a gentle reminder, please take care of yourself. Pause or do whatever you need to.
Yes, thank you, Riley, as always, for setting the tone. We'll start today by grounding ourselves in what the essence of grief is. So let's define it. Grief is the natural, emotional, physical, and psychological response to loss. It is how we process what matters to us when something or someone is no longer there. The American Psychological Association defines grief as the anguish experienced after significant loss. And while we often associate grief with death, it can also show up after any meaningful loss. For example, a relationship ending, a shift in identity, a diagnosis, or even unmet expectations about how life, quote unquote, should have gone.
Something important to name here is that grief isn't linear. It doesn't follow a clear set of stages or a predictable timeline. I might sound like a broken record by the end of this episode, but it's true. Grief can come in waves. It might feel different day to day. And sometimes it shows up when we really do not expect it. There's not exactly a right way to grieve, and there's no deadline or finish line for healing. Nor am I exactly sure what healing really means or what it might look like. Grief also tends to challenge our sense of control and safety. It can leave people feeling disoriented, disconnected, or unsure of how to move forward. And because grief is so personal, it can sometimes feel isolating, even when others are around us.
Exactly. With the complexity that grief brings and its deeply personal nature, we felt it was important to bring in someone who can help us better understand what is happening beneath the surface and how to navigate grief with a little more support and a little more compassion. Today, we are joined by our guest, Taryn Hiatt. Taryn is a compassionate social worker with Caring Connections at the University of Utah, bringing over 20 years of experience in suicide prevention and grief support. Her dedication is rooted in personal loss. Her father's suicide inspired her life's mission. As a founding member and former executive director of AFSP's Utah chapter, she has led vital prevention efforts and supported countless survivors of loss. Taryn also trains communities in programs like QPR and mental health first aid. After recently losing her mother to cancer, she remains a resilient advocate, offering hope, empathy, and unwavering support to those facing profound grief. Welcome, Taryn.
I'm excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. I feel like we've been communicating for a while now.
Yes, put a face to the name and a voice and all the things. So thank you.
Love it. Can you tell us a little bit more about Caring Connections and what that program is? I feel like it's such a great community based program, but a lot of people don't know.
Absolutely. I actually found Caring Connections after my dad's death by suicide. My dad died by suicide 24 years ago. And at the time, as I was looking for grief support, especially around suicide loss, there just wasn't anything. There was one support group in Layton, and that group still exists today. It's called Legacy Survivors. Judy and Don Bazowski started it after they lost their son. When I started looking, I came across Caring Connections, and it is a nonprofit out of the College of Nursing, but it's a grief and hope program. And so, what we offer is we offer support groups for families and individuals who've lost a person in their life that they care for. Our program is represented around death. So, it is represented for grief after a death. We do suicide specific groups. We do a group specific to those who've lost somebody to a substance use related death. We also do general loss groups, but we have loss of spouse, a loss of friend or family, a loss of child, just because of the nuance, right, around specific losses. And to again bring people together in a space where they can connect with others who share that loss. And our groups are an 8-week closed group led by a clinician. And what it means to be closed is once we start our group, we don't add additional people. And we have a curriculum that we follow that helps to educate people again about grief, about their loss experience, and help them learn tools to be able to navigate and integrate, right? That's our hope. As you so eloquently said, there's no deadline to this, there's no finish line. Every time a group member starts, they just want to do it right. They just want to feel different. They just want to be done. And I have to say, guess what? We're never going to be done. But thank goodness you're here and let's start that journey of healing together. We just embrace grieving people and want to provide support to them through groups. We also do some individual therapy as well.
Wow, that is excellent. I actually didn't even know this was a resource in our community. And I love that there is the intention of taking care of that nuance of different versions and variations and flavors of grief and different groups for all. That is incredible and such a amazing story of how you got to where you are and your involvement with it. Thank you for being willing to share that. And we appreciate that you're here, Tara. And I'm just so excited to learn from you and the resources that we have in the community. Before we really jump into all the fun questions, all the nitty gritty on grief, we typically like to kick things off by discussing either a snack you brought to the podcast, a snack of the moment, something you're into just right now because of circumstance, or just a favorite snack of all time. Everything is welcome. Guests always start first, Taryn. What did you bring to the podcast, or what's your snack of the moment?
What I brought to share today is the lovely Lorna Doone shortbread cookies. I was having a surgical procedure done at the hospital the other day. And of course, having surgery, you're not allowed to eat and drink before. And as we were in the waiting room, waiting, I guess that's why they call it a waiting room. I noticed this little bowl of treats, right? And I see these Lorna Doones. And of course, it sounded delicious, but it's a cookie my dad would always eat. He loved them. And so it just reminded me of him. And so, of course, I pocketed a few to have once my surgery was over. And when you'd asked me to bring one, I realized I still had a pack downstairs. And so, Lorna Doone, a little shortbread cookie in honor of my dad, Terry.
Oh, what an excellent snack. A beautiful choice and a beautiful way to take care of yourself post op and beyond. So thank you for being here post op. We so appreciate it. Procedures are never linear either. There's usually a lot of waiting. That's for sure. Riley, would you like to jump in and tell us about your snack of choice for today?
My snack of choice is not here with me in the moment. It's sitting at my desk, which is in the other building. So I'll get to it when we're done recording. I brought, they're like little packs of, I think they're dehydrated edamame. I found them at the grocery store the other day and they're really good. I've only ever had edamame fresh. Mhm. And they're nice and crunchy and still salty. They're delicious.
Oh, that sounds great. I love edamame in all variations. So that sounds right up my alley. That's awesome.
Yeah, I've never had it dehydrated before.
Hmm.
I'll bring you some.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, last but not least, Sarah, what did you bring today?
Well, I just returned from a camping holiday. I was up in the Tetons and I love summer season for many reasons, but I kind of switch up my snacks and I get into making trail mix. And I just made my first batch of trail mix for the season. So basically, trail mix. It's not with me either. I'm gonna disclose I did leave it at home. I was running around a little bit this morning. Out of transparency, I'll say that. But it is at home. I will have it when I get back home. And it's dried mango, toasted pumpkin seeds or pepitas, dried apricots, a little bit of almonds, coconut, and then you gotta throw cinnamon in there because it's one of the best spices all around. So that's what I'm up to right now. I'm finishing out my trail mix for my weekend.
That sounds awesome. I love hearing what snacks everyone brings to the podcast. I love that there's usually a story behind the snack.
I do too. Yeah, I think it just like sets the tone in a manner that is nice. It honors all snacks. It doesn't matter what you bring. All snacks matter. All snacks are important. Personal choice is so wonderful to see. Everyone has different things that they gravitate towards. As a dietitian, I'm such a proponent of always fueling the body, right? Making sure that we're staying fueled and taking care of ourselves. So thank you for all indulging in that. It's always one of the most fun parts of the podcast, aside from the wonderful content we get into. That being said, let's get into it. I'll start us off. Taryn, we defined it a bit at the beginning, generally speaking, what grief is, but we'd love to hear from you. How do you see or define grief and loss?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I'll just start by saying that grief is the most universal experience we will all have as human beings. Right now, I'm so obsessed with Anderson Cooper's podcast, All There Is, because he's interviewing families and saying, "Tell me about your person." When we're out in our communities, there's somebody sitting by us, around us, next to us, our work colleagues, that has also experienced grief. And most of us, grief is a yearning, it's a longing for either that relationship, the could have been, the should have been, or the what was. And just that wanting to have connection. We were just talking in a grief group I was in, blessed are us, the brokenhearted, that we had hearts that loved enough to be broken. Because can you imagine not ever having that intense feeling for something that it would hurt so badly when it was taken from you? And so when I think of grief, I love that you talked about it being a full body experience because it is. Not only does it break our hearts, it impacts how our body shows up and responds. It's physical, it's painful, raises our cortisol levels. Meh, none of us like that. You talk about body changes. It's just this completely encompassing feeling. And it is something that we can invite in and must invite in and offer a seat at the table because it isn't going anywhere. If we push it away, if we avoid it, it doesn't go away. It will show up. We call those grief bursts. And so we offer an invitation for grievers to just let it come in, invite it to have a seat, and then we can figure out how to best navigate your specific situation and grief.
I love that response because we've already mentioned it, but grief impacts us all very differently and shows up in many different ways. And I guess that's a great segue into our next question we were planning on asking you is what are common reactions or responses that you see people don't realize are grief? Like there's this thing happening and it could be associated with grief, but we don't recognize it in the moment. Is there anything that you notice?
Oh, so many things. And I'll just go through a couple basic emotions and experiences that most grievers, and again, I say most because we all experience grief differently. That'll be what you'll hear me say over and over again.
Right.
We are different human beings with different perspectives, with different relationships, with different capacities. So no two people grieve the same, even if it's the same loss. But one of the first experiences that most grieving people feel is shock. Even if it's somebody that was ill, even if it's a relationship you knew you needed to end, that finality of it, the actual leaving, is this immense state of shock. Like, how is this happening? Why is this happening? And what we encourage grievers to understand is this is actually your body's way of providing you some psychological anesthesia, because there is no way we could take in, especially in death and traumatic things like suicide, like car accidents, like a homicide. You couldn't take in that enormity of the situation as a human. It would break us. Our brains protect us with that shock. So, what that looks like in grieving people sometimes is a state of feeling numb, an inability to cry. And then again, I'll have a griever say, "What's wrong with me? I'm not grieving right. I can't cry." And I say, "Oh, just wait." Because when your body feels safe, it will come. Anger, angry at the situation, angry at the person who died, angry at whatever maybe took them, angry at the relationship, angry at the circumstance, anger itself, maybe anger itself because of how I showed up in the relationship or how they showed up to me. So I'm angry at them. And then I feel guilty because I'm angry. Like, you're this person that I cared for. And guilt is a common experience for grieving people because, again, that's us looking and saying, man, I wish that I'd done that differently.
Mm.
And what grievers have to be cautious of is when that guilt translates into shame. Guilt says I did something bad in this experience, said something mean, or I maybe ignored you, or I cut off communication, right? Whatever the thing is. And shame says, no, I'm just a bad person. I am wrong because of this. And shame is a difficult one. Specifically, we see this a lot in suicide death and overdose and substance use deaths. I know in our experience, when my dad died by suicide, my dad's family's first response was, "We're going to say he had a heart attack." And I said, "No, no, that's not what happened. That's not how he died. And why would we not tell people?" And I get why. I know why, because 24 years ago there was, and there still is, so much shame around what it means to take your own life. And
Mm.
and so that's a common thing. People feel ashamed of, what did I do? And we start to attribute again, there must be something I did, as if we, especially children, right? We see this happen with kids. What was wrong with me? I mean, I was 26 and I still felt abandoned, you know?
Mhm.
And so can you imagine a young child or a little person? And so, guilt is part of it. Shame is part of it. Isolation, right? We pull away and hide. And this is what a lot of grievers don't realize they're doing. We don't want to be out in public. We're afraid that, what if I have that grief burst? What if I do the ugly cry? Because you ask me how I'm doing, and then I want to say. And so we pull away and we hide out. And it's hard to engage again back in life, especially after death. You all know this. Right after the funeral, for example, everybody's there in the days and weeks leading up. They're there for those first couple weeks after, and then everybody goes away. Everybody goes on with their life, and you're still sitting there going, a bomb literally just went off in my life. Nothing looks the same. Nothing feels the same. What do you mean? Come back to work. What do you mean? Right? Invest in love again. And
Mhm.
so there's a lot of complexities, but those are, I would say, probably the most common. So shock, guilt, anger, blame, trying to understand, isolation. Those are really common feelings for grievers.
Yeah, I really like the terminology used of psychological anesthesia. That's a really great way to encapsulate how our body and mind are trying to take care of us in that moment. And it's a lot to process. And how could anyone process all of that all at once in any circumstance? And so I wrote that down actually. I'm going to hold on to that as a term. So thank you for sharing that. I think that brings me to ask the question of, when we're looking at grief, are there different types of grief that an individual can experience? I think we touched on that lightly, but if you can expand on that, that would be lovely.
Yeah. grief being so unique, but there are a couple different types. We talk a lot about disenfranchised grief when we talk about suicide death, overdose death. Disenfranchised grief is a grief that is not socially endorsed. Again, because of stigma. I always used to make this joke, so just bear with me. I grew up in Utah and I live in Utah County. And when our dad died by suicide, nobody was showing up with the creepy green jello with the carrots in it. And again, not because people didn't care. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to say.
Mhm.
And as humans, none of us like to see someone suffering, and we want to be able to come in and help and fix it. And so often we're really clumsy in the things we say, and we say things that are hurtful. And so people stay away. And that's what disenfranchised means is you feel like, I don't know if I can even grieve because my person did this. It's one of the reasons we separate our group because, again, sadly, I've heard in a group setting, well, your child chose to end his life. My kid had cancer. He didn't choose that. And so you can see even amongst grievers this anger, while again not understanding the complexity that goes into a suicide death or a substance use related death. And so disenfranchised grief is one. We talk a lot about anticipatory grief. This is where maybe you, again, have a person that is diagnosed with an illness. I'll just use my mom, for example. My mom was diagnosed in 2007 with multiple myeloma, told that she would be lucky if she had a year to 3 years. My mom made it 18 years. We knew death was coming. Okay. We had a lot of time to anticipate it. We see this with dementia, where again, you know that they're going to go, or cancers, right? You know they're going to go. But even when the death happens, it's still shocking because now it's here. Now it's the finality. So, but a lot of grieving people, that anticipatory grief is just gut wrenching. Again, in substance use cases, families who they're waiting for that phone call. They know that one day that call could come that says your person overdosed or we found them dead. And so that when it does happen, they feel this overwhelming sense of relief because they know my person's no longer struggling or I don't have to wait for that anymore. And then they feel guilty because they feel relieved, right? What kind of person must I be that I feel relieved? And so again, just us talking about that, I was so relieved the day I found my dad dead because my dad had struggled his entire life. And the sense of relief I felt knowing I don't have to worry anymore. And he can finally be at peace. So, anticipatory one is huge preparatory, right? We're preparing. Again, for some, it gives you time. You can heal, you can mend, you can say and do the things that we wish. I always use my parents' deaths as these really dramatic contrasts because quite honestly, both of them chose to be done living. My mom battled cancer for 18 years, got to a point where she had done chemo. It made her so sick. She said, I'm done doing this. I just want to live whatever time I'm given, how I want to live it. Kidneys failed and she went. My dad battled this other illness, but yet his was so sudden and so traumatic with so many unsaid things. And hers was this peaceful, loving, surrounded by family. And as I try to hold those two things, it helps me to understand what matters and why those things are gifts. It was a gift to me to have that time, and what a contrast to be able to do the things with my mother that I never could do with my father. And so some of that you'll see come up. We see people struggle with ambiguous loss, the uncertainty. Again, I can come back to suicide and overdose. Sometimes people don't know. Again, if we don't have an autopsy done, a clear communication, if the person's intent was to die, it was an overdose or something, could it have been accidental? Or, there's a lot of families who'll come in and say, my person would never have killed themselves. And maybe that was right. So there's this uncertainty. And so they have to live with the not knowing. I go to an example we've all seen recently on the news, Savannah Guthrie's family, of having a person be kidnapped and missing. And so then again, this ambiguous loss of, I don't have closure because I don't know where you are. I don't even know if you're alive. And yet ambiguous loss can show up for those of us who still have people living. Again, think of the child who may be struggling with addiction, who's homeless. Parents don't know where they are. They don't know if they're safe, if they're alive. Somebody who serves in the military, a parent who's deployed, parents who are incarcerated. And there's this uncertainty of, how are you? Where are you? And not knowing. There's so many different ways that grief can show up So, ambiguous loss, disenfranchised grief, anticipatory grief, those are several key ones that we typically see.
I was thinking when you were saying that people just don't know sometimes what to say, they don't know what words to use. And I don't think they intend to harm, but those words can harm when you're in that vulnerable spot. And I was thinking, my mom lost her sister really young. She was 8 years old when she passed from cancer. And I remember she was living in a community that was fairly religious at the time. And the response she got from people was like, oh, well, it was God's will. It was God's will that your sister passed. And that's something that's never left my mom. Like she'll still bring that up time and time again. That taught her a lot of what to say, what not to say, how to be so open minded. And I think that phrase just guts me, just thinking of my mom as such a young person and experiencing that loss. So words matter and being able to help people find the best way to articulate. There's no perfect way, of course, but articulating in a different manner is so helpful. So that's what that brought me when you were explaining that. I'm like, oh, I know that so well.
Thank you for sharing that because, that's one of the first things we say in our group is no premature spiritual support. Again, people might have that belief system on their own, but it is not my place to say, oh, they're in a better place. And aren't you glad they're not suffering? I might feel that way, but it doesn't help me to hear that from somebody else. What helps me is that just sit with me and say, I'm sorry. Sorry your person's gone. Sorry you went through this divorce. I'm sad that you're hurting. That's all we need to say.
Yeah, it can be that simple.
I was just wondering, Taryn, are there different approaches that you take working with folks? When we're talking about different types of grief, right? Are there different approaches you take or interventions, or is grief just grief?
Great question. And again, grief is just grief, but it is very personalized and unique. And so the best advice is just meet people where they are. For example, if a family came to me and was uncertain about the cause of death, it's not my place to say, even if we have a medical examiner's report, right? I'm going to meet them where they are, allow them to navigate that space in their time to get to where they can either find acceptance. That's one of the hardest parts. Again, I love that you talked about stages. There's no stages of grief. And there are different feelings and emotions, right? Denial, bargaining, anger, guilt, acceptance. But we can feel all of those in one day. And so I think it's just meeting people where they are, understanding the relationship they had with the person or the thing that they're grieving, understand what they bring. Something we see in grieving people a lot is even my best tried and true coping skills that I've used my whole life to get through every other crappy thing. They don't meet the bar that is needed sometimes. And so sometimes I have to ditch old ways and I have to learn something new to come to that. So those would be a couple things I would suggest.
When people come to you and say, how do I grieve? Is there a right way to grieve? Like there's this secret formula or something like that. What do you say?
Yeah, and again, I always joke in our groups, if I had a nickel for every time I've heard that, I'd be rich. But you know what I tell people is again, there is no right or wrong way. One day does not predict the next. We all know that. You have a good day and then you're like, okay, maybe I've turned the corner. And then the next day the grief swallows you whole again. I loved your analogy about the grief comes in waves. Years ago, I came across a poem, and we don't know who it's attributed to, but it's called The Shipwreck of Grief. And where I find it now is on Reddit. So you could just use the Googles and go there. But anyway, it's this story that a man it says that grief comes in waves. In those first few days, the waves are relentless. They're 100, 200 feet tall, no time in between, just crashing you to the shore. And here you go again. You come up sputtering, you catch air for a minute, and then the other wave comes. And I relate to that. And then he talks about, but as time goes, the waves get a little smaller, they get a little further apart. You have more time between that wave that crashes, but then out of nowhere, that 100-foot wave comes and takes you back out again. But again, you come up for air and you get that little bit of distance. And how he ends it is something that I'm passionate about. But again, not everybody is. But he says, if you're lucky, you'll have many shipwrecks because you'll have loved and you'll have given. And again, as much as I dislike this quote, but it's true, grief is the price we pay for loving and connecting and investing. If we didn't love and connect and invest in a relationship, we wouldn't grieve it, right? We wouldn't miss it when it's gone. And so I have a choice. I can either engage and invest and love, or I don't. And some grievers, after a really intense grief, might say, you know what? I ain't doing that again. You talked about divorce grief. That's a big one. I see a lot of people who say, you know what? Actually, I'm not going to do that just yet. But yet, that's a word I always tell people, yet. You maybe didn't do it yet.
Yeah.
No right or wrong way, man. You just got to let grief be and let it show up how it shows up, but be prepared with things that can support you when grief does show up.
I love that quote. Whoever came up with that about waves, I think that's such a beautiful way to encapsulate it. It hits when it hits, but with time, that intensity tends to lessen.
And something I heard, that I'll just share quick, is I met David Kessler years ago at a conference for long-term loss survivors of suicide. And actually, Robin Williams' son was there, and he spoke and shared his story about his dad. But David Kessler is someone who, again, he was with Kubler-Ross and wrote many books with her. And she talks about her stages of grief, that really those were intended for like stages of dying. This is what people go through in like a hospice setting. They had nothing to do really with grief, yet they just kind of got lumped in. And anyway, he'd mentioned that in his work early on in grief, he would tell people, like, it's going to get better. It's going to get better. And then his son died of a drug overdose. And he said, I wanted to go back to every parent I said that to and say, I was wrong.
Mhm.
I was wrong. And he said, it doesn't get better. It gets, and I love this, it gets different. And I think just hearing that as a grieving person, it's going to get different. That gives me that little flicker of hope that it won't always feel as intense and awful as it does right now.
Yeah.
It never goes away. If we were to meet when you're on your deathbed, you'll still be talking about the people. I'm going to still be talking about the people that I lost. I talk about my dad all the time. It's been 24 years. I think about him almost every day. It's that learning how to carry it and bring it. But I like that idea of it doesn't get better. It gets different. I like that.
Yeah, it never goes away, but it changes with time. And that relationship to it changes in time. I think that brings me to a question I'm so curious to ask you, Taryn, which is what do you wish more people understood about grief? You've talked about so many important concepts here, but what is something that really stands out to you that you wish more people knew?
What do I wish more people understood is, again, I wish us as grievers understood what it means to grieve and what it looks like. We call it grief literacy. Okay. And again, we're trying to teach people to be more compassionate, because what we usually say in grief is, tell me what you need. Let me know what you need. We put it on the griever. We put it on the person instead of just saying, hey, I'm going to come pick the kids up for you. Hey, you know what? I'm dropping dinner off tonight. Or, hey, you don't like dinner? Here's a DoorDash thing. Here's grief groceries. Like, we just do the things. What would help you now? Do you need to be heard? Do you want me to listen? Do you need help? Do you want a hug? What do you need? And then following through with those things. And so I think for us to be willing to step into uncomfortable spaces as people, that's what I want to see us do. Like you mentioned, another favorite quote is, I will sit with you in the dark if you can't look on the bright side. That presence, that's what I wish more people would be willing to do. Again, you can't fix it. You don't have to. That's the best part. You don't have to. You don't have to make it better. You just have to be there. People, when they say those clumsy things or the things that are hurtful, they're not doing it to be mean. This is just, we don't talk enough about grief. And my gosh, we get 3 days of bereavement leave when your person dies, for
Yeah.
crying out loud.
Yeah.
We don't hold space. In other cultures, you have to think back. There used to be like a mourning period for a spouse. She could wear black with her veil and cry, and that could go on for years. Nobody expected anything of her. And my goodness, to some degree, we get back to some of that where we just understand that grief fundamentally changes people. You are not the same person you were before or after. And that's hard for grieving people because they just want to get back to normal. But understanding that it's going to be a new normal. And I know we're all sick of that term after COVID, but it's true. There's a new normal way of going about things because I'm different. And so I think that's something just to keep in mind.
What does healing mean in the context of grief? What does it mean to be healed?
When I think of what it means to heal, and this is what we see, is it means that I can hold the enormity of my pain. I can feel the sadness and the sorrow, and I can feel joy for the time I had. I feel gratitude for the person. I feel grateful for the memory. I feel grateful for the Lorna Doone that my dad taught me to eat, right? I learned how to hold those two things to where neither one is consuming me. Where, and again, you'll know this, Riley, as a clinician, where we see people get stuck is the ones that stay solely in the story of the death. They can't escape the circumstance, or the ones that avoid it completely and are clear over here moving into the new life. What we know happens and when grieving people heal is when they could go back and forth. It's called this dual process model of coping, where they can be in the loss oriented part, then they can also look ahead to the future and they're able to do both without staying stuck in one or the other. Like I mentioned, we can't just live in the future all the time and pretend it didn't happen. It'll wait for you and it'll show up. So invite it in sooner. And then hopefully, as we navigate it, we learn to integrate those things. And again, we learn that, okay, I get to bring this person with me or this situation with me. I get to take what I've learned. Don't say everything happens for a reason. While that might be true, it never feels good in the moment. And it's up to me to decide what that reason is. I don't need someone to tell me. I get to learn what I want to take from that. So healing again looks different for people, but it's when they can start to integrate those two things and hold space for both.
I'm curious because you talked about being compassionate. When we talk about taking a compassionate perspective of grief, let's say it's a family member, a spouse, a partner that is aiming to support someone that has lost, whether it's something or someone.
Mhm.
What advice do you have for those individuals that are playing that support role, that they can lend more compassion and be there for that person in the best way that they can be?
Great question. So I love just the word compassion. If we break it down to its literal meaning, right, it means co, and then passion is the Latin word for suffering. So to co suffer with somebody, again, that means entering this room of suffering to be present. Now, for me to do that, I got to be taking care of myself too, because that's heavy.
Mhm.
I always encourage supporting people that know your place and also know when you need to take a step back and say, I actually can't. I'll give you an example. My mom, when she died, my stepdad, who's 91, my mom was young. She was only 72 when she died. But he is someone who, in the beginning, I took over and I was showing up and doing all these things. And, you can't see, you can't drive, blah, 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 blah. But it got to a place where never once did he ask me, how are you? It was so focused on his loss, and that's normal. It was a spouse loss. They've been together for 30 years. Of course, that's all he can see. And so, as a grieving person, I had to recognize there's so much I can do for him, but then I also have to step out so that I can have my grief experience too. And this is the hardest part in families. Because again, no person is unaffected by the grief, but yet our roles change and we start trying to do things or show up in ways that, again, might not be healthy for us. So it's a willingness to be in that room of suffering, yes, but also knowing when to step away and how to practice good self care. You guys all know the analogy, put your mask on before you help someone else. I mean, that's the truth, right? If I am coming in and trying to serve and be helpful, but I'm also suffering, that's not fair to me and it's not fair to that person. And so just taking care of yourself too would be really, really big.
I think that that's so important because maybe just my caring stance when someone that I know is going through a loss or experiencing something, my first response is to just be there, right? Jump on it and support them, which is great. And if I am already in a space where I can't do that or I can do it only for so long, I think it's just important to be mindful our own stuff is going to show up in the room as well. And we need to be mindful of how we're supporting other people too.
We do a whole week on relationships in our group where we talk about this because this is the hardest part is how to navigate some of this. And what we try to encourage is that willingness to just be honest that says, I had to just say, listen, I love you and I want to help, but I can't right now because I need to take care of me again so that he's not thinking I'm mad. I just had to be honest. I just can't right now. I'm going to step away for a little bit, let others step in. And so I think that willingness to also communicate our needs, right? We ask other people, tell us what you need. Well, I'm telling you what I need too. And so I think getting that willingness to also be honest, with ourselves, but also with the people around us on what we need too.
It's funny, our next question that we were planning on asking you is oftentimes people say, "Let me know what you need," or "Let me know how I can be here for you." And most of the time, we have no idea what to say to that. We don't reach out, and it puts the ownership on the person grieving. So I was going to ask, what is helpful to say to someone when they're grieving? But we've kind of touched on that.
And the only other thing I would add is again, we step in and there's some things to be mindful of. Here's things we encourage. After my mom's funeral, everybody left. They brought all the flowers, took them all to my stepdad to their house. And as we came in, I looked at his face and I could just see he was overwhelmed. And I was like, what's going on? And he goes, oh my gosh, look at all these flowers. I can't try to keep all these alive. And I just paused and I was like, oh my gosh. Because now he's thinking, again, he just watched his wife, who he tried to keep alive for all these years, right? Like, I didn't think about that. So, again, maybe we don't bring flowers. Maybe we ask, is there something you'd like a donation to? Grief groceries. Can I pick the kids up? Can I this, that, the other? Great example. I have a dear sister in law, their whole family were driving down to St. George for her husband's daughter's wedding. And late at night, deer had come out in front of the car. He swerved and missed the car, rolled the car. They luckily all survived the roll, but as he got out to try to get the family out, he was hit by another vehicle and ended up dying. And of course, at the time, they're down in St. George. He'd gone through a week of trying to get him to stay and just horrific things. So I had a neighbor who reached out to me that was my friend when I used to live over there. And she says, what can we do? And I just literally said, go to her house and see what needs to get done. Is there laundry? Are there groceries? Are there just and go show up and see what we can do to help. And they did. They mowed her grass, they pulled her weeds, they just so that when she came home, those were the least of her concerns. And so I think sometimes it's just looking to see like, what can I do that would be helpful?
Mhm. Just being there and being present, especially weeks, months after the person's passed, because that is the escalating time. That is the time when people feel so isolated.
And remember those days. Remember the death day. Remember their birthday. When we're grieving, folks are like, oh, I don't want to ask because I don't want to bring it up. We want you to ask. We want to talk about it, most of us. And again, even if it's a relationship that went really bad, I want to tell you what a piece of crap he was and why I left or whatever, right? And
Yeah.
I'm being facetious. But we often hold back because we think, oh, I don't want to upset him when maybe they need to talk. And again, you can ask permission. Do you want to tell me this story? Do you want to talk about it? And if you don't, hey, that's okay. Again, I'm just here. I still have friends who will text me or call me on October 5th. That's the day my dad took his life. And we'll still just say, I'm thinking of you. And I have those same people in my life that I know those days. And I just get to say, hey, just want you to know I'm thinking of you. Drinking a Coke in honor of your person, or I'm doing this because that's what they would do. I think those are other things we can do too, is we help them remember if they want to remember.
That's so important to ask the permission because not everyone's in a place where they're ready to talk about it. They're ready to have that conversation. But how beautiful is that to be asked, right? Because then the other side of the coin is that, oh my gosh, yes, I do want to talk about this. And no one's asked me and no one has given me that space. And now I have that space. I really like the permission piece of it and just giving people that choice in a position like that. I think when you're in grief, when you're dealing with loss, you didn't get to choose any of that. So, how nice is that to have a little bit of choice brought back to you? That is a really nice comfort and a really nice piece of humanity that's offered.
Something you'll hear me say, as we've even talked today, and this was new to me coming back into grief work, is, I don't say loved one because again, I don't want to assume the relationship. I don't know whether it was somebody that loved them or was me. Like we all just went through Mother's Day. What a complicated day for so many people. Because again, we don't know what the relationship was like. I have a young gal in one of my support groups right now whose mom died by suicide. And she says, I didn't have a good relationship with her. I'm sad she's gone, but I'm navigating the fact that I was really angry with her when she died. And so, again, it's just that willingness to meet them where they're at. And I don't have to say, because again, I've heard it, right? Oh, but she's your ma. Well, she may have been a crappy one. Just being willing to validate and meet them where they are. And again, whatever is their experience, that's what I want to honor.
I wish we had more time with you, Taryn, but I'd love to wrap up our time that we do have to ask you, maybe it's advice, maybe it's an offering of information. If someone is listening to this episode and they're actively in their own grief right now, what is something you would want them to hear?
Yeah, what I would want you to hear is again, your grief is yours and it's valid. And however you're feeling, whatever that emotion is, like I mentioned in the beginning, feel it, invite it in, allow it its space. Again, it doesn't mean it will be with you forever, but honor that. Honor that there is something that was so meaningful or at least connected to you that you feel this immense amount of loss, regardless of what it is, and allow yourself that time and space to feel that, to grieve that, because you deserve to heal and you can. It's a journey. It's not going to happen in one day, but that's why groups like ours exist. We're here to walk people through that. Most grieving people will do just fine on their own if they have supportive friends and family. But for those of us who may not, that's why we're here. That's why community exists, so that we can be around others who get it and they can walk us along the way.
Wonderfully said.
Karen, thank you so much for being here. This conversation is so important, and I really value your gentle and kind hearted way of approaching grief. It's so complex. So, you're doing wonderful work, and we really, really appreciate you taking your time to be here today.
Mhm.
For those in the community, how can we find Karen Connections?
Thank you for the opportunity. What a gift you're providing to help grieving people feel less alone. So, thank you so much for this. And you can find us at the College of Nursing, Caring Connections. If you use Google, you'll be able to come to our website. We offer events throughout the year for grieving families and people. We have one coming up. We also have groups. We hold them 4 times a year. We train people if you're interested in running groups, Caring Connections. So you can find our website, email us, call us 801-585-9522 if you're one that still likes to use the phone. We'll answer and we'll connect you to the support you need to get you through.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Take care and be well. Riley and I are going to wrap up this episode with a bit more discussion on how grief overlaps with each of our domains of practice. And as always, break down myths surrounding the topic. Conversations like grief and loss are layered, as we are all complex beings and have unique responses. As we have been reminded in this episode, grief shows up very differently for all of us. Let's dive into the potential impacts of grief on nutrition. And I say potential because it's going to be a spectrum. So, we'll look at some potential impacts. We'll look at strategies we can use to support others and ourselves. And we'll break this down to hopefully make it really tangible and usable for either oneself who is going through grief or a good reminder for anyone that is supporting someone going through grief and loss and helping them perhaps maintain some of these habits or support them and making sure that these self care practices still remain intact as much as possible. So, a grieving individual may be more inclined to skip meals, lose interest in preparing meals, consume more convenience based foods, overeat to numb feelings, eat what we would call an unbalanced diet, simply meaning that there's a lack of variety, having an altered hunger or satiety cue standpoint. So that would be an essence of maybe we aren't feeling hunger the same way we used to. Maybe it's not showing up. Maybe we can't find that fullness or that stopping feeling. Someone going through grief and loss may be less inclined to stay hydrated. it doesn't feel like it matters. Staying hydrated doesn't feel important. We're not even thinking about caring for self in the moment. It also may feel really challenging to plan meals, maybe shop for food, maybe prepare meals. Maybe we did that with the person that we lost. Maybe we did that for the person that we lost. And so that can be a difficulty. And then on the occasion, we do see with grief and loss, sometimes food gets replaced with other substances, and individuals turn towards perhaps alcohol or recreational drug use to kind of fill that void. So it's truly a spectrum. Here, the impact will be different, but those are key indicators and signs to look for or notice in self. This is changing for me. This is changing with my behaviors. This is changing with my relationship with food. And while food and eating can feel complex and absolutely can be emotionally driven in this state, during this state and this time of being, nutrition does have the power to support self care, comfort, pleasure, enjoyment, connection to culture and family traditions, which may be really important at a time like this when grief and loss are very new and fresh. And nutrition also has the capability to renew energy levels and alleviate some of that generalized fatigue or malaise that we feel with grief and loss. So, in knowing all of that, how do we combat it? How do we help someone that's experiencing these different aspects? Some strategies we can think about putting in place to curb these challenges are aiming to focus on small, frequent meals, and that's choosing what we classify as a balanced snack or mini meal, and I'll get into that. But what's most important is that it doesn't feel of overwhelming portion size when there's so much abound, so many choices, so many options. It can feel like a lot, and we don't have the mental bandwidth or energy to make those choices. So we want to focus on something that's small, frequent, it doesn't feel overwhelming, it's easy to assemble. That's one of my top tips, I would say. It's easy to assemble, it doesn't require a lot of thought preparation. And then when we come back to thinking about that balance concept, it has everything represented. Our complex carbs, our protein, our fat. If we don't know what those are, there are macronutrients, and syncing up with a dietitian is a great way to learn more about those. So, how do you put that all together into examples to make it more seamless, more applicable? Could be Greek yogurt paired with raspberries and your nut butter of choice. It could be toast with egg, cheese, herbs, greens, whatever sounds right. Half of that, some of that, all of that I mentioned. Another example could be a sweet potato with salmon packet, half of an avocado, some bell peppers, and whatever seasoning feels right. Those are examples of things we can assemble quick, fast, and they provide us the things that we need in a moment that is really challenging. Another strategy to think about is stocking the house with staples. So, this includes having the freezer stocked maybe by a friend, a family, someone that's supporting you in this time, or you doing this for someone you are supporting in this time, with items that are versatile. They can be used across multiple meals. They're pre cut, they are pre portioned. Again, taking the guesswork, extra energy out of the preparation process. And they'll last a while in the freezer because appetite changes. Hunger may be not there, and then it might be really there. And so, if we have things that are on hand and available, but don't go bad, spoil quickly, we're more likely to fuel ourselves and be able to help that person fuel themselves adequately. And so those can be things such as frozen veggies, fruits, salmon fillets, chicken breast, any protein variety that you know that individual or yourself do typically like, loaves of bread, soups, things of that nature. The third piece to this is socialization. And Taryn talked about this previously, that socialization is key, and particularly around meal times, when possible, it's really essential. Eating with others can make a significant difference rather than spending it alone. So perhaps it's another family member or friend to share a meal with. Maybe it's joining grief support group and cooking together. Maybe it's using video chat and getting creative there to craft and share a meal with someone who lives far away but is a core piece of our community or a core pillar of support. All of that can establish a sense of normalcy and provide a connection when we likely need it the most, even if we don't recognize we need it the most at that time. And then lastly, I made a small gesture to it earlier, but consider working in tandem with a dietitian, a mental health therapist, a grief support group. With those providers, they can respectively help you stay nourished and process the complexity of grief. So, with all that, that's a lot of information regarding nutrition, but hopefully gives the basics to provide some strategies to support and recognize when our relationship with food is starting to take a hit or an impact from grief and loss. Riley, I'm curious after hearing all of that from your lens, how do you feel our domains of practice can best support a patient, perhaps as a united front, that is struggling with grief or loss?
What first comes to mind to me is just communicating. Communicating with one another is a really great place to start because everyone's needs are going to look different. And it's really great to have these two different sides of the spectrum or lens or whatever you want to call it, where we can work together to kind of assess what individuals' needs are. With that being said, I get that that's the norm within our relationship and within our clinic that we work for, that we talk about clients quite often and we have that, but that's not the norm. And so I would love a world where we could check in semi regularly with other people's treatment team, right? Dietitian, therapist, medical provider, physical therapist, any of the above, because I think that it's helpful and we think in different ways
Totally.
can just help address some of those really unique needs that come up for people when they're exposed to grief.
Yeah, what comes to mind for me, going off of what you said, is sometimes it can be important to have a joint session or what we would call a co visit for a patient that's experiencing grief and loss because one, it allows them to perhaps not have to repeat their story multiple times over, which might feel quite challenging, but it also allows them to unpack their, whether it be nutritional challenges and or emotional challenges and emotions that are surfacing for them simultaneously. So I love the idea of that collaborative care that I know we talk about often and I hope becomes more of a norm, as you said, because I think if you have that opportunity to bring, let's say, a dietitian and a mental health therapist into that space, into that consult room, it can allow for shared goal setting and a coordinated care plan where both the mental health therapist and dietitian can align those nutritional goals with psychological milestones. Therapy is, a beautiful practice because it can uncover the root cause of, let's say, emotional eating, if that's what is on tap, while a dietitian can help support management of symptoms and create gentle, an emphasis on gentle, and realistic nutritional strategies to support nutrition being more of a self care focused task rather than a self harming task during this time. So, I would love to see more of that because I think that would be such an excellent way to support patients simultaneously and not overwhelm and add more appointments to their load and having to work with, multiple providers in different settings. So that's what it brings to mind for me.
Thanks, Sarah.
Sure.
Well, before we move on, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a newer diagnosis called prolonged grief disorder. So, this is a formal diagnosis that was added to the updated DSM version in 2022. To meet criteria, you need to have experienced a loss at least 12 months ago and have some persistent grief responses. For most people, grief changes over time. Like Taryn was saying, it doesn't go away, it just gets It's different. It becomes a little bit more integrated into your life. But for a small group of folks, grief stays intense and persistent in a way that really interferes with our daily life. The key thing here to think about is not how long someone has been grieving, it's about how stuck they feel in that grief and how much the grief is getting in the way. People might experience ongoing, overwhelming longing or preoccupation with the person who died, deep emotional pain, or a sense of life that feels meaningless or impossible to engage in without them. What we understand from both the research and just within clinical work is that this does not mean it's a failure to cope. It's more like our brain and our nervous system are having a hard time updating to our new norm and new reality of life. The bond with the person is still very active internally, even though externally they might no longer be with us. In therapy, goals for treatment and working with prolonged grief disorder is not to take away the grief, but to help someone carry the loss in a way that they can still also live their life again. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit more about the myths out there.
Yeah, well, beautifully said. I just wanted to quickly comment that I think that's a highly important takeaway from today's conversation is that grief doesn't end, that it continues. But the wonderful aspect of having support groups like Carry Connections and working with a mental health therapist like Riley is that they can help you carry that loss and continue to build your life wherever it takes you in the aftermath. So, thank you for speaking to that. That's a really important newer diagnosis that we're coming to learn more about and find out about. We'll close out today, as Riley said, with a few myths. We've probably touched on a few of these throughout our conversation today with Taryn, but to really cement it in there for the listener and make it concrete, we'll start with the statement that is utilized often, and I often see it in media, as in film, books, TV shows, and it's that grief has stages and you move through them in order. And that pertains to the five stages of grief, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And often we see in the public sphere that those stages are fixed and you move through them in a set order. And sometimes you see that used comedically, right? Where people move through them really fast, really quickly in a comedic context. However, that's not the case for most of us. We don't move through it in a specific way, we don't move through them in a specific timeline. And Riley, I'd love for you to speak more to that.
Yes, we don't move through all of these stages in a specific order, or we might not feel them sometimes. I like to use this model as a framework. It's a tool, it's not the entirety of what we are going to experience in grief. As we've mentioned time and time again, grief is not linear. It's really like those waves that we were talking about earlier in the session. Sometimes they're calm, sometimes they can be really intense. Oftentimes they're unpredictable. These stages are really important to have, and they were first described by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I hope I'm saying that correctly, in her book on death and dying. And it's actually a common misunderstanding that you need to go through these stages in a very certain order or the same way as someone else. And that's not the case. Great guideline to look at, but we might not feel all of these and it might not be in that order.
The next myth we have is time heals all wounds. So just letting that phrase sink in. Time heals all wounds. What does the listener think of that? I can tell you what we think of it, which is um, the phrase is essentially encapsulating the idea that there's this unspoken timeline. Let's say it's arbitrary, but 6 months to a year, where you should be feeling better, right? That there's some finite amount of time that you should be feeling better and that you should have navigated through grief. There's that endpoint. You've done it. You've turned the corner, as Taryn said, right? You've gotten there. And as we've spoken to previously, intensity of grief certainly modifies with time. And grief follows us as we go. So, is there an endpoint, Riley? Is there a timeline where we should be feeling better? Talk us through that.
No,
No.
I wish. I wish there was a timeline. I hate that saying. Or oftentimes it'll get better.
Ooh,
Sometimes that's the case for some people, but for a lot, it's not. And like Taryn was saying, it will get different. We will adapt to the new norm, but it doesn't necessarily get better. And so this one comes up often. And truth is, I wish there was a timeline, but there's not. And it doesn't just disappear after 6 months or a year.
I think it's a great learning experience for all of us. Some of us perhaps haven't experienced grief and loss yet, right? Yet is the key word. All of us will at some point. And it's hard to know before you've experienced that what that feels like, that it doesn't end, but it changes. A quick personal aside, when I had a significant loss and experienced like true grief for the first time, that's when that all clicked for me. And I just remember there were moments, and there still are moments, where I think, oh, like, it feels less intense and it doesn't feel like it hits the same way. But then something triggers a memory, or you talk to someone and you're reminded of that person, and you feel all those feelings rushing back, whatever those feelings are. And I think it's just an important reminder that is welcomed and that's okay. And that doesn't mean that you're not healing and finding your way in this different chapter of life. It just will always impact us in small moments and big moments and all the moments in between.
All right, last myth that we have for you today. If you're functioning, you must be fine. Sarah, what are your thoughts about that?
Ooh, don't love that one. Functioning and fine are very different concepts. So, this is certainly a misconception. I would say patients, people, individuals are really good sometimes at masking, and they may return to work because we have to, right? We have a short bereavement leave, as Taryn talked about, or we may have responsibilities like we're a caregiver to someone else, we're a parent, we're in charge of a company, we run a nonprofit. And so sometimes we have those responsibilities we have to come back to. And we might appear, and we put it in quotes, and you can't see us, but air quotes like fine, right? We might appear fine on the outside to colleagues or maybe acquaintances that don't know us quite as well, but that does not exclude that person from perhaps being in grief privately or not feeling like they can show that grief. And that grief may be present when they go home or when they're with different people or in private moments when they're taking a break from work or stepping out of their office or the building. And that is really important to remember, that that concept of fine and functioning, they're very different states of being.
As we've talked about, people grieving and holding grief very differently, or grief impacting us very differently. Functioning does not equal healed. In fact, I think functioning could be used as a distraction or maybe a maladaptive coping mechanism for someone's grief. Maybe it feels too painful that they use functioning from an outside perspective, air quotes. They look fine,
Yeah.
but internally, there's a lot more going on. And maybe from a therapeutic perspective, maybe it might be kind of too much for them to manage and handle. So that's also my response is, even if you are functioning, that's great. And might still be experiencing some stuff, or you might be avoiding.
Absolutely. Well, as we wrap up today's episode, we reiterate that grief touches every part of each of us. There is no proper way to experience it. There are certainly maladaptive behaviors or coping strategies that can present. And so when we say proper, we mean it is an experience that is variable per individual. And that wonderful analogy is like riding a wave that comes in all flavors and all fashions.
If you're going through it right now and it feels heavy or confusing, you're not doing it wrong. You're just human.
Be gentle with yourself, be gentle with others that you're supporting right now. Small acts stack up to support important outcomes: rest, nourishment, hydration, social support. One of my favorites, social support. These are all valuable to navigating grief with kindness and with intention.
And if you're showing up for someone who is experiencing grief, just being present is enough. Show up for them. Send texts that you're thinking of them. Send that e-gift card, right, for food, or just find ways that you can show up. You don't have to be perfect. You can acknowledge that you're going to make mistakes and say the wrong things. But showing up for individuals is really, really important.
Yes, very much so. Well, that's all from us today. Take care of yourselves, take care of one another, and as always, be well.
Be well.
Thanks for listening to the Be Well Collective. If you have any ideas for future episodes or questions, please email bewellpodcast@aruplab.com. If you liked what you heard here, rate and subscribe for more. The information provided in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. ARUP Laboratory and the Be Well Collective do not assume responsibility or liability for the actions, decisions, choices, or opinions of the individual listener. The content shared should not be used as a substitute for diagnosis, treatment, or medical guidance. Always consult with a qualified healthcare provider before making any changes to your care plan. Listening to this podcast